Summer 1756. Friedrich the Great faces the grim fact that half of Europe has formed an alliance. It seems to him that their aim is the annihilation of Prussia. Therefore, he makes a preemptive strike against Saxony, which surrenders weeks later. But this is only the first chapter in what would become known as the 7 Years' War. Prussia is completely encircled by her enemies, the biggest continental powers in Europe. England and Hanover are her only allies. Prussia's situation is easy to sum up. To be or not to be. That's the beginning of this game of Friedrich. It's a light war game for wait a minute, get rid of the silly hat. There we go. It's a light war game for 2 to 4 players, where one player is playing the troops of Prussia, attempting to deal with 3 other players who are allied against them. It's an interesting asymmetrical game. Each player has a set of objectives they're trying to reach. And throughout the game, the smaller players will be knocked out. And so if the player playing Friedrich can survive the full game, then Friedrich will win the game, or Friedrich can take their objectives, they'll win the game. Otherwise, each of the other players has a set of objectives they're trying to take. So the other players are all working against Friedrich. They're all allied, they can't attack each other, but only one of them can win. So only one other player can actually win. Now when we played the game, we said, hey, all the good guys win, hooray! But in reality, if you play by the rules, only one of the other players can win, which introduces an interesting game balance. So, let's talk a little bit about what comes in this box. Here's what comes with the game. You get a heavy-duty board, a fairly large board as you can see. You get 4 decks of slightly revised playing cards. You can see these are in the normal suits of cards, but there are no jacks, kings, queens. They've been replaced by 11, 12, 13. And in addition, each deck has several reserve cards with the numbers 1 to 10. You get 4 decks of these cards, and you're going to work through those cards as you play the game. You get some special cards. These are some of the timeline cards up close. For the first 5 turns of the game, you don't draw these cards. After that, then you draw one of these cards after everyone goes. And these can have major impacts on the game. As you can see, there's one card that says Russia quits the game. And so at that point, the Russia troop is out of the game, cannot win. Things get a little easier for the player playing Friedrich. So different powers will be knocked out of the game with these cards. There are also some of the cards that are written purely in German, but thankfully they provided you with a translation sheet, and so you can pull out the translation sheet, you can find the matching card. These cards, you pull them out, and if you're playing the basic game, you just read what it is in spades. So it says next turn, the first TC, which is tactical card, those are the playing cards, played by France is worth an additional point. These are small random effects. You get a number of small wooden tokens, that each token represents a general and their armies. You get some wooden blocks that represent supply trains that supply the generals and the armies. You get sheets of paper like this that you're supposed to cut apart. Each player has their own small sheet, and this is what's used to indicate the size of your armies. They're going to grow and shrink as you get into battles. You get some reference cards, which helps everyone remember the rules. And you get one quibble that I've got with the game. You get this. It's designed as a postcard or playing pieces. It's up to you. You can cut it apart, flip it over, glue the front and back to each other, and then cut out these little bitty chits. And these can be used to mark spaces on the board. My scissoring and gluing skills are not quite what they used to be. So I went out to the local hobby shop, and I purchased some translucent pony beads, which are small plastic beads in the colors needed. And I can use these beads just as easily as I can use those little chits without all that messy gluing, pasting stuff. So the components are of a mixed bag. The cards are about the same as normal playing cards. They're going to be seeing a lot of use. They did give you 4 decks, which makes it easier to go through all of the decks. Probably the biggest complaint is this postcard thing. Now how does all this stuff work together? Well, let's take a look at play. We're going to focus on a small section of the map in order for me to better explain how this game works. That's one thing I actually did notice in the game is, despite the board being very big, most of the action took place in a few localized areas. Now while the board looks convoluted, I'll explain a few things about it and it will come into play. So what to notice here is that first we've got these grid lines that run all throughout the board. Each grid line forms a square, and within the grid line there's a suit. So for example, in this square, diamonds are the suit that are used if there's a combat. In this square, hearts are the suits that are used. So that's the first thing to look at when you're looking at the board, is the board is covered with these squares and there are suits indicating there are suits in the middle of each square, and that's very important. There are lines that connect these different dots. The strong lines are roads, and you move faster if you're traveling on a road. The weak lines are just normal paths. Some of the dots have small flags in them. The flags indicate objectives, and it's the goal of each country to take over their objectives. And to take over objective, you simply have to move over that objective when there's not an opponent close to the objective. So first you have to drive the opponent away, and then you can take over the objective. So the yellow player is attempting to take over all these objectives that you see here with these flags. The white player is trying to take over the gray flags, and the blue player, who's Prussia, who's going to be in the middle, is trying to take over blue flags or just wait around and get to the end of the game, and keeping anyone else from taking their objectives. What's going on here is right now we're in this yellow territory, and one thing that means is this yellow chit represents a leader and a batch of troops, and the number of troops you have are going to be written down on these little sheets that I showed you earlier. So you're going to have for each leader, you're going to have how many troops are currently in that leader's army, and that's hidden information until you go into a battle. Now, when you're in your home country, you don't have to worry about being supplied. But as soon as your army leaves the borders of your home country, you have to worry about having supplies for the army. And that's what the cubes represent. The cubes represent a supply train. Once you cross into the territory of someone else, so now that the blue players crossed into the yellow territory, they must remain within 6 dots of their supply train or they go away. That's a bad thing. So one of the things you can look to do is to try to try and attack the opponent's supply train or block connection to their supply train, which is going to cause them troubles. So that's part of the strategy in this game, is you're moving your troops around, but you also have to make sure that you keep a supply train in with them to make it all work out. So what you do on your turn is, when it comes to you, you get to move all of your troops on the board. You can move all of your armies 3 spaces. You can move your supply trains 2 spaces. If you're on a road, you get to go a little bit further. And you control all of the objectives that are yours within 3 spaces of your army. So for yellow to take an objective, yellow is actually, for yellow to take this, if yellow is here and blue is here, for yellow to take that, first they're going to have to scare the blue player away by fighting them. Once they scare the blue player away, then they can move in and actually claim the objective. Let's look at this battle now. Blue is going to be fighting in diamonds because that's the suit that's in the territory that they're in. Yellow is going to be playing hearts because that's the suit they are in. So an important part of this game is watching what suits your armies are in and making sure it matches the strengths you have in your hand. So if yellow moves up, says, I want to fight you, blue, each person will reveal the number of armies. So blue might say, well, I have 5 armies. Yellow says, I have 2 armies. And then the fighting begins. The weaker player gets to play cards first. So right now it's 5-2. So the yellow player can play hearts. So the yellow player might, for example, play that. And say, all right, well, I have 8. I had 2 before, and now I have a total of 8. So now it's 8-5. So now the blue player can play cards. So the blue player could say, well, I have that. So now I have 13. So now it's 13-8. So the yellow player now has to play. The yellow player could come in with this. This lets him choose a number from 1 to 10. Usually it's going to be 10 unless you're trying to be tricky. So the yellow player can say, well, I'm going to make that a 10. So now I have 10 plus 6 plus my original 2. So I'm at 18. So the blue player might be running out of diamonds and be panicking, saying, uh-oh, what do I do? So the blue player is at 13, so right now it's 18-13. So the blue player could play this and say, all right, well, I'll play that. Takes me up to 16. So now it's 18-16. The blue player is still losing, so the blue player gets to go again. and might not have any more diamonds. So the blue player says, all right, I lose. You then subtract the 2. 18 to 16 is a difference of 2, which means the blue army loses 2 of their armies, which you mark on that sheet of paper, and has to retreat 2 spaces. Combat then is very interesting. You have to determine your battles. You pick them, you decide when you don't want to play anything and just take some hits and run away. You can also use these cards, by the way, to build up your armies again. That's one of the other things you can use cards for. So, to give you an overall flow of how the game goes, you've got Prussia in the middle with the dark blue, and they also have a few troops in Hanover to control. And they basically have to fight a number of different battles at the same time. You've got France over here. France doesn't get a lot of resources. They move very slowly, but everything is fairly controlled for them. Russia on the other side of the board has objectives spread all over the place, so they've got to really spread out. You've got Sweden here, which only has 1 army, but has a number of objectives they could try and reach. Austria down here at the bottom has probably the strongest other power on the board other than Prussia, but has a lot of objectives to try and take. And the Imperial Army here, again, it's 1 army, a few number of objectives. So 1 player controls these 2, 1 player controls the 2 greens, 1 player controls the dark blue and light blue, and 1 player controls red. And that's how the game works. Having donned my silly hat, I shall now tell you what I feel about this game. It's a fantastic hybrid Euro war game to introduce people who are into the lighter Euro games into a card-driven war game, to get a taste of what it's like. For gamers, I would give this game a solid A. For non-gamers, it's going to be a little overwhelming. I would say probably about a C for people that aren't used to this. It's not as bad as some other games of this ilk. It's a good introductory game, but it can be fairly complex. So with that, you can reenact Prussia. Will they survive, or will they be crushed? What? Prussia, Crussia. Anyway, take care. I will see you on a future week of Board Games with Scott. If you'd like to see more little clips like this, go to boardgameswithscott.com. With that, I'll thank you for showing up and talk to you later. Bye-bye.